The Hollowing Night. The town of Ashwood had always been quiet, the kind of place where nothing extraordinary ever happened. It sat at the edge of the sprawling blackthorn forest, an endless expanse of ancient trees that seemed to stretch on forever. Ashwood's history was like its people, reserved, unassuming, and shrouded in shadows. But every resident knew of the whispers, the stories passed down through generations, about the nights when the forest seemed alive. It was said that every 33 years the Hollowing Night would come. The details of the tale were vague, a mixture of half-forgotten lore and superstition. Some spoke of disappearances, others of a strange, hollow sound carried on the wind, like the mournful wail of something not entirely human. Most dismissed it as myth, a way to keep children from wandering too deep into the forest. But this year, as the calendar turned to October, the town's old fears began to resurface. The arrival of the stranger. The first sign of trouble came with a stranger. Nobody new ever came to Ashwood. It was a town off the beaten path, accessible only by a single winding road that cut through miles of dense forest. But on a chilly morning, as mist hung heavy in the air, a rusted black car rolled into town and stopped in front of the diner. Out stepped a man who looked as though he'd walked straight out of another time. He wore a long, weathered coat, a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face, and carried a leather satchel slung across his shoulder. "Morning," he said to the waitress, his voice low and gravelly. He slid into a booth by the window and ordered a black coffee. The waitress, a woman named Marla, who'd worked at the diner for over 20 years, couldn't help but notice the strange symbols etched into the leather of his satchel. They looked old, ancient even, like something out of a history book. "Passing through?" she asked, setting the coffee down in front of him. He didn't look up. "Something like that." It was only later, after the man had left, that Marla noticed the faint smell of ash lingering in the air where he had been sitting. The hollow sound. That night, the 1st of October, the sound began. It was faint at first, so quiet that many dismissed it as their imagination. A low, resonant hum, like the vibration of a distant tuning fork. But as the nights wore on, the sound grew louder. By the 5th night, it was unmistakable, an eerie, hollow wail that seemed to come from the forest itself. It was unlike anything the townsfolk had ever heard, a sound that seeped into their bones and kept them awake long after midnight. By the 10th night, the animals began to act strangely. Dogs barked at nothing, their hackles raised. Cats hissed and refused to go outside. Even the birds, usually so lively in the mornings, were nowhere to be seen. Then the disappearances began. Missing the first to vanish was Tommy Grayson, a 12-year-old boy who lived on the outskirts of town. His parents said he'd gone to bed as usual, but when they checked on him the next morning, his bed was empty. The window was open, the curtains fluttering in the cold breeze. On the windowsill was a single black feather, unlike any bird native to the area. Next was Sheriff Harris. He had been investigating Tommy's disappearance, combing through the forest with his deputies. They found his patrol car parked at the edge of Blackthorn Forest, the driver's door open and the radio crackling with static. But there was no sign of the sheriff himself, just the same black feather lying on the front seat. Panic began to take hold. Parents kept their children indoors and the streets emptied well before sunset. The sound, that terrible hollow sound, was now constant, a dreadful backdrop to the town's growing fear. The warning. The stranger appeared again on the 13th night. This time he stood in the center of town square, beneath the old clock tower that hadn't worked in years. A small crowd had gathered, drawn by his presence and desperate for answers. "You've all heard it," he said, his voice carrying over the restless murmurs of the crowd. "The sound, the hollowing has begun." "What are you talking about?" Marla demanded, pushing her way to the front. "What's happening to our town?" The stranger's eyes, sharp and piercing, scanned the crowd. "Every 33 years, the Hollowing Night returns. It is a time when the veil between this world and another grows thin. The sound you hear is their call, and they will not stop until they have claimed what they came for." "Who are they?" someone shouted. The stranger hesitated, then said one word: "Hollowborn." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Nobody had heard the term before, but it filled them with an unexplainable dread. "How do we stop it?" Marla asked, her voice trembling. The stranger reached into his satchel and pulled out an ancient book, its leather cover cracked and worn. There is a way, he said, opening the book to a page filled with cryptic symbols. But it requires a sacrifice. Into the forest. By the 15th night, the town was in chaos. More people had disappeared, and those who remained were too frightened to leave their homes. The stranger, now known as Elias, had taken up residence in the church, using it as a base to prepare for what he called the ritual. Emily, a high school senior and one of the few who refused to give in to fear, decided to confront Elias. Her younger brother Tommy was among the missing, and she was determined to bring him back. If there's a way to stop this, tell me, she demanded, storming into the church. Elias looked up from his book, his face grim. The forest holds the answer, he said, but it is not without danger. The Hollowborn will protect their prize. I don't care, Emily said. I'll do whatever it takes. Elias studied her for a moment, then nodded. Very well, but you must understand. Once you enter the forest, there is no turning back. The heart of the Hollow. Elias, Emily, and a small group of volunteers entered Blackthorn Forest under the cover of darkness. The air was heavy, suffused with a strange, hollow sound that now seemed to emanate from all directions. Shadows moved at the edge of their vision, and the deeper they went, the more the forest seemed to come alive. We're close, Elias said, stopping in front of a massive, twisted tree at the center of a clearing. Its roots were blackened, and the ground around it pulsed faintly, as if alive. This is it, Elias said. The heart of the Hollow. The ritual must be performed here. As he began to chant from the book, the ground trembled and the Hollowborn emerged. They were tall, gaunt figures with hollow eyes and mouths that stretched unnaturally wide. Their presence drained the warmth from the air, and their voices joined the hollow sound in a terrible harmony. Keep them back, Elias shouted as Emily and the others formed a protective circle around him. The sacrifice. The ritual required a life, a willing sacrifice to close the veil. Emily's heart sank as she realized what it meant. Elias looked at her, his expression apologetic. It must be you, he said. Only someone tied to the missing can bridge the gap. Emily hesitated, her mind racing. But as the Hollowborn closed in, she knew there was no other choice. Taking the dagger Elias offered, she stepped into the circle and made the ultimate sacrifice. The Hollowborn let out an ear-piercing wail as the veil began to close, their forms dissolving into the night. The sound stopped and the forest fell silent. Aftermath by dawn, the missing had returned, disoriented but alive. The town mourned Emily's loss, but they would never forget her bravery. The hollowing night was over, and Ashwood was safe, for now.